Welcome to our in-depth examination of the world's deadliest ongoing armed conflicts. In a world often consumed by the allure of progress and the pursuit of peace, we find ourselves grappling with a stark reality. Conflict, in its most brutal forms, continues to cast a long shadow over humanity. Today, we delve into the top 30 conflicts that are shaping the global landscape, bringing destruction and despair to countless lives. From the battle-scarred streets of the Middle East to the forgotten corners of Africa, we will bear witness to the human cost of these conflicts, exploring the historical roots, the complex geopolitical dynamics, and the devastating impact on innocent civilians. For decades, the Palestinian conflict has been a festering wound in the heart of the Middle East. Rooted in historical grievances and competing claims to land, the conflict escalated dramatically in October 2023.
Images of families huddled in fear, the cries of children caught in the crossfire, and the smoldering ruins of homes and hospitals serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of this intractable conflict. The recent surge in violence has claimed the lives of hundreds of civilians, leaving a trail of devastation and despair in its wake.
What began as a wave of peaceful protests during the Arab Spring in 2011 quickly descended into a brutal civil war that has ripped Syria apart.
The conflict has become a tangled web of alliances and rivalries, with the Syrian government, various rebel groups, and international actors vying for control. Millions have been displaced, forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The world has watched in horror as ancient cities have been reduced to rubble, and a generation of Syrian children has grown up knowing nothing but war.
In 2014, the world watched as Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. But it was in February 2022 that the conflict escalated into a full-scale invasion, sending shockwaves across the globe.
The images of Russian tanks rolling across the border, of Ukrainian civilians taking up arms to defend their homeland, and of families torn apart by the fighting have become seared into our collective memory. This conflict is not just a regional crisis. It has far-reaching implications for the international order, raising profound questions about the future of Europe and the balance of global power.
Chapter 4. Myanmar, the junta's iron grip. Myanmar, once on a fragile path to democracy, has been plunged back into darkness following the military coup in February 2021. The junta's brutal crackdown on dissent has led to widespread human rights abuses, with thousands arrested, tortured, and killed. The country's ethnic minorities, who have long faced persecution and marginalization, have borne the brunt of the violence. The international community has condemned the coup and imposed sanctions, but the junta has shown little sign of relenting. Chapter 5. Yemen, a forgotten catastrophe. For years, Yemen has been ravaged by a brutal civil war, often overshadowed by other conflicts in the region. The conflict escalated in 2014 when Houthi rebels seized control of the capital, Sana'a, prompting a Saudi-led intervention. The ensuing fighting has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions facing starvation and disease.
The conflict has become a proxy war, with regional powers backing different sides, further fueling the violence and exacerbating the suffering of the Yemeni people.
Chapter 6. South Sudan, a nation torn asunder. South Sudan, the world's newest nation, has been plagued by conflict since its independence from Sudan in 2011. Political rivalries, ethnic tensions, and competition for resources have fueled a brutal civil war that has displaced millions and left the country on the brink of famine. Despite numerous peace agreements, the fighting continues, trapping civilians in a cycle of violence and displacement. the international community has struggled to find a lasting solution to the crisis, leaving South Sudan facing an uncertain future. Chapter 7. Central African Republic, a nation held hostage. The Central African Republic has been trapped in a cycle of violence and instability for decades. A multitude of armed groups, often divided along religious and ethnic lines, have terrorized civilians and fought for control of the country's resources. The presence of these armed groups has created a climate of fear and impunity, making it nearly impossible for the government to establish control and provide security for its citizens. The international community has deployed peacekeeping forces to the country, but they have struggled to contain the violence and protect civilians. Chapter 8. Mexico, the grip of the cartels. For years, Mexico has been locked in a brutal war against powerful drug cartels. These criminal organizations, often operating with impunity, have turned parts of the country into lawless battlegrounds, terrorizing civilians and corrupting government institutions. The Mexican government's war on drugs has led to a surge in violence, with tens of thousands killed in cartel-related violence. The cartel's influence extends far beyond Mexico's borders, fueling drug trafficking and violence throughout Central America and the United States. Chapter 9. Colombia, a fragile peace. Colombia, once synonymous with drug trafficking and guerrilla warfare, has made significant strides towards peace in recent years. The 2016 peace agreement between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, was a historic achievement, ending decades of conflict. However, the peace remains fragile, as other armed groups, including the National Liberation Army, or ELN, continue to operate in the country.
The Colombian government faces the daunting task of consolidating peace, providing justice for victims, and addressing the root causes of the conflict, including poverty, inequality, and the lack of state presence in remote areas.
Chapter 11. Ethiopia, the Afar conflict. Adding to Ethiopia's woes, the Afar region has become embroiled in a conflict that has further destabilized the already volatile Horn of Africa. Fueled by ethnic tensions and exacerbated by the ongoing Tigray crisis, the Afar conflict has led to widespread displacement, humanitarian suffering, and a breakdown of law and order. The conflict highlights the complex web of ethnic and political fault lines in Ethiopia, threatening to unravel the fragile fabric of the nation. Chapter 13. The Sahel, a region adrift. The Sahel region of Africa has become a breeding ground for instability, violence, and humanitarian crises. A complex interplay of factors, including ethnic violence, jihadist insurgencies, weak governance, climate change, and poverty, has turned the Sahel into one of the world's most volatile regions. The violence has displaced millions, disrupted livelihoods, and created a breeding ground for extremist groups, posing a threat to regional and international security. Chapter 15. Nigeria, Boko Haram's reign of terror. Boko Haram, an extremist group notorious for its brutality, continues to terrorize parts of Nigeria and neighboring countries. The group, whose name roughly translates to Western education is forbidden, has waged a violent insurgency aimed at establishing an Islamic state in northeastern Nigeria. Boko Haram's tactics, including suicide bombings, mass kidnappings, and attacks on schools, have displaced millions and created a climate of fear. Chapter 17. Afghanistan, a nation adrift. 20 years after the US-led invasion, Afghanistan is once again under the control of the Taliban. The withdrawal of foreign forces in 2021 led to the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the return of the Taliban to power. The country is facing a humanitarian crisis, with millions facing starvation and economic collapse. The Taliban's return has also raised concerns about the future of human rights, particularly for women and girls who face a bleak future under the Taliban's repressive rule. Chapter 19. Central African Republic, Anti-Balaka Violence. The Central African Republic has been torn apart by violence between Christian militias, known as anti-Balaka, and mostly Muslim Salika rebels. The conflict, which began in 2013, has led to widespread atrocities, including ethnic cleansing and mass killings. Despite the presence of international peacekeeping forces, the cycle of violence continues, displacing hundreds of thousands and leaving the country mired in humanitarian crisis. Chapter 21. Nigeria, Christian militia violence. In Nigeria's Middle Belt, violent clashes between predominantly Christian militias and predominantly Muslim herders have claimed thousands of lives and displaced hundreds of thousands more. The conflict is driven by a complex mix of factors, including competition for land and resources, ethnic and religious tensions, and the failure of the Nigerian government to address the root causes of the violence. Chapter 23. Kashmir, a disputed legacy. The disputed region of Kashmir, claimed by both India and Pakistan, has been a flashpoint for conflict for decades. The territorial dispute, rooted in the partition of British India in 1947, has led to 3 wars between India and Pakistan and numerous smaller clashes. The conflict has had a devastating impact on the civilian population, displacing millions and fueling human rights abuses. Chapter 25. Iraq, a nation scarred by conflict. Iraq continues to grapple with the legacy of the 2003 US-led invasion and the subsequent rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. While ISIS has been territorially defeated, the group continues to carry out attacks, highlighting the fragility of the Iraqi state and the deep sectarian divisions that continue to plague the country. Chapter 26. Cameroon. The Anglophone crisis deepens. The Anglophone crisis in Cameroon continues to escalate as the government's heavy-handed response to separatist demands has only fueled the violence. The conflict has displaced hundreds of thousands, disrupted livelihoods, and created a climate of fear and impunity. The international community has called for dialogue and a peaceful resolution to the crisis, but a lasting solution remains elusive. Chapter 28. Iran, a nation in uproar. Iran has been rocked by protests following the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who died in police custody after being arrested for allegedly violating the country's strict dress code. The protests, which quickly spread across the country, reflect deep-seated anger over economic hardship, social restrictions, and political repression. The government's brutal crackdown on the protests has drawn international condemnation. Chapter 30. The Sahel, a microcosm of global crises. The Sahel region, facing a confluence of challenges including climate change, poverty, weak governance, and conflict, serves as a stark reminder of the interconnectedness of global crises. The region's plight highlights the need for a comprehensive approach to addressing these challenges, one that recognizes the underlying drivers of conflict and instability.